Hello and welcome to the third episode of the ASEF Public Diplomacy webinar series. Greetings from Asia Euro Foundation here in Singapore. And thank you so much for joining us in this public conversation on cultural diplomacy with our esteemed panelists. This episode is in collaboration with the Philippine Embassy in Singapore. We did not anticipate such an overwhelming response from you, so we thank you very, very much. My name is Trisha Octaviano, and I manage the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training Project. It is a project series that is supported by the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. This webinar is being broadcasted via Zoom and YouTube live stream. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, your microphones are automatically muted and your videos are turned off because this webinar is chat-based. You may, however, ask your questions at any point using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can also give your comments using the chat box. Please clearly state if you want us to read your comments. Your questions will be read aloud and we will mention your names. Please also include where you are from. However, you can let us know if you would like to pose an anonymous question. And for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, we have a very good number on there. You may also ask your questions and give us your comments at any point during the webinar. Please give us your full name and let us know where you are from. And if you want to pose a question anonymously, just put in there that it's an anonymous question. ASEF staff will collate the questions and comments from both streams. Please be informed that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on YouTube. So our conversation will be moderated by Ms. Anupama Shaker, who is ASEF's Director of Culture. In this capacity, she is in charge of ASEF Strategy in Arts, Culture, and Heritage, and is responsible for ASEF's program, portfolio, and culture. So before I give her the floor, I'd like to just invite you to join the conversation on social media and use hashtag ASEFPDT and hashtag ASEFculture. So now, Anu, I give you the floor. Let's start the conversation.
Thank you, Trisha. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on how relevant is cultural diplomacy in the face of a global crisis. Cultural diplomacy has long been called the linchpin of public diplomacy. It wouldn't be wrong to say that cultural diplomacy really leverages the soft power of countries, helping nations to win friends through attraction rather than coercion. As with everything else in our world today, cultural diplomacy has been deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And today, in this hour-long conversation, we are going to delve into how and what the new directions are. And joining me for this conversation are three distinguished speakers: Ambassador Eduardo Meñas, Ambassador Leon Faber, and Marie Lesud. Please allow me to briefly introduce them. Ambassador Eduardo Meñas from the Philippines is currently Assistant Secretary at the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Office of Strategic Communication and Research. He's a second-generation career diplomat who joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1991 and has been posted in many different parts of the world, including Netherlands, Iran, Japan, Singapore, and at the United Nations in New York. As many of you are probably aware, the Philippines is a member of the Asia-Europe Meeting ASEAN Informal Dialogue Process, and ASEF is the only permanent institution of ASEAN. Welcome, Ambassador, and it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Good afternoon to you and to all the viewers.
I now turn to our other speaker, Ms. Marie Lesud. Marie is an old friend of the Asia-Europe Foundation. She is currently the Secretary General of On the Move, which is a very well-regarded information website as well as a network meant for artists and for cultural professionals, focusing specifically on cultural mobility opportunities. On the Move is a partner of the Asia-Europe Foundation, and we have collaborated several times with this organization. Prior to her current role, Marie directed the French Cultural Center in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And prior to that, I'm very happy to share that she worked with us here at the Asia-Europe Foundation between 1999 and 2006, where I think she did some very important work to build the strong foundation in those early years for the cultural cooperation work that we continue to do to this day. A pleasure to collaborate with you again, Marie.
Thank you very much, Anupama. Thank you for this invitation and greetings to everybody.
And last, but most certainly not the least, I turn to Ambassador Leon Faber, who has just taken over as the 8th Deputy Executive Director of the Asia-Europe Foundation just 10 days ago. A seasoned diplomat with almost 30 years of experience behind him, he has served in many different roles as the head of mission of the EU delegation to Lao PDR, as the Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Luxembourg, and as the Charge d'Affaires of the Luxembourg Embassy in Hanoi. Throughout his career, he's worked particularly on issues surrounding human rights, health, humanitarian affairs, and development cooperation. Thank you for joining us today, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first appearance in my new function, so I'm really thrilled and grateful also to be here and able, hopefully, to contribute a little bit. Thank you.
So let's get our conversation going. To kickstart our conversation, I'm really going to jump to the question at the heart of our webinar. Is cultural diplomacy now really relevant in the face of this global crisis that is raging all around us? And I'm going to top it up with a question we've received from one of our audience members, Ms. Lucia Bakova from the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic, who asks, is it really important to put everything else aside and only focus on public health now? So in this context, how will you defend the importance of cultural diplomacy? Ambassador Menyes, may I turn to you first for your take?
Thank you, Anupama. And let me begin my response with a quick survey. How many of you are watching this webinar in the comfort of your underwear or pajamas at home? How many of you haven't traveled to your favorite haunts or dream destinations in the past 6 months? And how many of you know people who face depression or anxiety over the loss of work, physical isolation from family and friends, and are living in fear of contracting this virus? If any of you answered yes to those questions, then you know that cultural diplomacy is even more relevant today as the world has become a captive audience where minds need to be nourished to replace the loss of physical socialization and movement, and as we now live in a world of virtual congregation and escape. As UNESCO recently tweeted, in times of crisis, we need culture to make us resilient, give us hope, remind us that we are not alone. Cultural diplomacy can be a mode of learning and is now a coping mechanism that has been made much more accessible through ICT tools, social media, and digital meeting platforms. These types of communication have provided a new medium through which the message of culture bringing people together must be pursued not only by governments and foreign ministries, but also by regional and global cultural institutions and even by private individuals. One of the experts in cultural diplomacy, Professor Hans Kochler, who teaches at the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin, often cites the opening sentence of the UNESCO Constitution as a raison d'etre for the role of culture in a world in crisis. Please allow me to paraphrase that sentence and adapt it to present circumstances and make it slightly more gender sensitive. Since wars, and I would add depression and paranoia, begin in the minds of people, it is in the minds of people that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Isn't it ironic and strangely comforting as well that the ease by which this virus is transmitted from person to person also describes the ability of good cultural diplomacy to go viral and infect the minds of millions of viewers with a better understanding of a foreign country, people, and society. I believe that this is how we practitioners must make cultural diplomacy more relevant in a world that thirsts for a positivity, not of the COVID kind, but a mental and even spiritual positivity and optimism that will help society survive under this new normal. And with regard to that question, certainly not. We only should not be focusing on the public health crisis. But as I have just outlined, there are many other things that should preoccupy the minds of everyone.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I'll turn to you, Ambassador Faber.
Thank you very much. And I obviously agree with very much what Ambassador Menyes has said. I wanted to concentrate briefly on bilateral issues, but also then on others and individual participation, and also then finally multilateral cultural diplomacy. As you have pointed out in the beginning, cultural diplomacy is kind of a new concept, but it has been applied over the centuries for immemorial times. And we know that, for instance, in ancient times, strong cultures could also assimilate others. Like in China, when they were invaded by the Mongols, they were able to make the Mongols even more Chinese than they were themselves. At the same time, in more recent times, we see, for instance, that culture has played a very important role. If we look, for instance, at America and the Anglo-Saxon world, what influence they have had on global culture. So all of this shows that, first of all, culture and cultural dialogue is very important. And I think that, of course, it is part of how nations brand themselves, how they show what their values are, what they are looking for, what they want to share with others. This is, of course, often benign, but it can sometimes also be negative and then it falls more under the concept of propaganda that we want to influence public opinion in another world. Now, of course, we are in these times of pandemics, we see that, and that is my second point actually, is the relevance of each of us individually. And I think especially in the COVID times, where we not only discuss on social media about health issues, but we have a great responsibility of, I think, to stick to facts and figures rather than look into what some conspiracy theories could be done. So I think, again, this is a very relevant and a very important aspect that we should be aware of. Now, finally, I wanted to say a word on multilateralism. I think that, of course, as we said before, cultural diplomacy has been largely the pillar of bilateral cooperation, and often when countries did not have much in common and they were looking for to do more together, they would start maybe out with an agreement on cultural cooperation or so. So that included maybe exchanges of scholarships and theater and whatever, maybe sometimes also sports events or so. But now I think we're coming into a situation where, as Ambassador Menyes has also said very clearly, the COVID is spreading all over the world. And at the same time, we're basically in a situation where many of us start to question globalization. And some of us even have issues on our own identity, and then turn into the easy part of, or the easy way out on nationalism or falling back on those values. So I think multilateralism in that sense is extremely important, and because it shows a way how we can address these issues, and how we can, as I said, based on facts and figures, figure out what we should do and how we should address that. So that is for me something very, very important. And I sit here in front of the ASEF logo. So I think that's what ASEF is also doing. That is our raison d'être, and that is what we stand for, to promote this multilateralism and cultural viewpoints, exchange of views, cultural dialogue. I think all of these are very important issues that we must promote and not forget. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And now I will turn to you, Marie, as the voice of the cultural communities of Asia and Europe. How do you see cultural diplomacy and its relevance in the current times? Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I guess it all depends as well in relation with this question, how cultural diplomacy is defined, and more importantly, how it is implemented and by whom to whom, following which process and for which time frame as well. I think in a very, of course, positive outlook to the world, cultural diplomacy can be, of course, very relevant for all the contribution and positive format it can support. But I guess there are many concerns among the artistic and cultural sector. And of course, these concerns are being, I would say, exacerbated right now with the global pandemic, which usually, unfortunately, add also in particular context, another layer of complexity to also crises, which can happen for economic, political, environmental reason at national level. And I would like to raise three forms of this concern as well, coming from the artist and cultural sector that we can hear in the meeting that you hear as well, I am sure in your meeting at the level of Asia-Europe Foundation. There is a first concern. The first concern from the artist, curator, cultural professional, it's more like, am I chosen for my work? I am chosen for what I can bring in terms of artistic vision, or am I chosen because this program is part of your country, which has a special agreement with my country, for instance? Mm-hmm. So this is a concern that we hear very often. The second concern, it's also that too many artists and cultural professionals are not valued economically, supported economically in their own country. And sometimes the very same country are kind of using culture as part of their export strategy, branding strategy. And I would say that this situation is even more exacerbated now. We see the power of culture and artists online, definitely. In a way, there is an overload of information and event online, but very rarely artists and cultural professionals are paid for that. And last, a concern, and I think this is the most crucial in the Asia-Europe context, it's also the higher competition for funding schemes that are already decreasing because of national priority, and it was also addressed in the former presentation. And in this respect, I will also share in the chat the latest joint statement by UNIC, which is the European Network for National Institute for Culture, which really advocate for more support for international cultural relations, because a lot of artists and cultural professionals, particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia, depend very much on international and European support. And funding cuts have already a lot of impact on them locally and of course for their international collaboration. So I would say that we have also to take into consideration this basis of concern so that we can also work together and act at all our level of competency, be it at a bilateral, multilateral level, as Ambassador Faber mentioned it, and also to work on a change of system where definitely arts and culture have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I think hearing the three of you, I think we're all in agreement that the arts has a particularly important role to play during this pandemic. It makes us more resilient. It has been comforting us, entertaining us, helping us in our moments of introspection. But then when we move into the realm of using the arts and cultural diplomacy, or as Marie has raised the issue, cultural relations, and this is a new debate. In the last decade, I think we have heard the terms cultural diplomacy and cultural relations being used rather differently. And this nuance has now emerged into large debates. And I'm glad Marie has raised this issue, as one side is seen as something state-led, while the other side, cultural relations, is seen something that is more in the hands of civil society, of artists and cultural professionals. And this leads me already to a question that I have from a curator in Malaysia, Si Huet Wong, and I'm going to quickly post that here. What role for the curator in cultural diplomacy? Who makes the final decision in a cultural diplomacy project? Is it the artistic director, or is it the diplomat who has certain political goals to achieve? And I'm also going to throw in another question that has come to us from Michael Fisher from the Philippine Embassy in Cambodia, who asks, how can we conduct cultural activities in a way that is sensitive to the suffering of people in the middle of the pandemic? So I was wondering, any quick thoughts on these questions before we move ahead in our conversation? Ambassador Pablo, please.
Can I just jump in? Of course, this is a very relevant question, but with arts, it's always a bit complicated, because if you have a state-led artistic creation, you always have, of course, the risk that the government will influence what you have to say. But I think on the other side, for me at least, it is extremely important that there is a need for artistic freedom. So it cannot be always the government. Of course, the government will, if the government finances something, it will be difficult to be very critical of that government. But nevertheless, we need to assure. But then again, I come back to the multilateralism, because multilateralism can assure, at least to a certain extent, this freedom of artistic creation. Thanks.
Thank you. Ambassador Menyes?
Yes, on this point, of course, I can only speak from the Philippine perspective. And with regard to the question about who curates, who decides, we have recently conducted a stakeholders conference here in the Philippines with all the cultural partners involved in international engagements. So we had over 100 stakeholders, from artists, from institutions, museums, and we brought them all together for 2 days to discuss the state of cultural diplomacy and what they thought the directions needed to be taken in this particular regard. And after the 2 days of consultations, we had another meeting, and we drew up a strategic plan for cultural diplomacy for the next 3 years, from 2020 to 2022. And again, we sought the buy-in of all the cultural stakeholders within the Philippines. And so we now have a sort of a map that is a commonly discussed, commonly agreed direction for cultural diplomacy. Of course, this all happened before COVID.
Okay.
So we've tried to adjust, maintaining the same objectives, but just moving everything online.
Thank you for that. And I think it's very encouraging to hear that artists and governments are talking and working together. And perhaps we will hear during this conversation also of more examples of this partnership between the two sides. On this note, I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit more towards digital. Of course, the arts have gone digital in a very big way during COVID-19, and with it, cultural diplomacy. So I was wondering if you have encountered any interesting initiatives in the realm of cultural diplomacy post-COVID, anything innovative that you would like to share with our audience? And again, there's been a lot of conversation about the benefits of digitalization. So yes, let's touch upon that. But what pitfalls must we avoid in our rush to get very excited about going virtual? So could I turn to Ambassador Leon Faber for your responses first?
Well, thank you. Well, I think that generally speaking, of course, whenever we are exposed to culture and artistic creation is always good, because it's bound to our souls. So in that, so whatever we do, and I think in that regard, what I found most impressive was all the museums, the initiatives that they took to go public and go virtually public. So I think that was for me an eye-opener, and that the same goes maybe for concerts that we can watch on or even if it's old concerts or whatever. So that is also, I think, something good. But of course, on the other side, what the negative side of it, we are, I think, as human beings, we have different senses. We're not only seeing and hearing, we're also smelling and tasting. So it doesn't smell when you look a concert or you know, so that is, it's just not complete if we are only digital. That is basically what I would have to say on that. Thanks.
I will now turn to Ambassador Menez, please.
Yes, I think I have some images. Okay.
Yes, they are on now. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that this pandemic has disrupted all our normal operations and forced us to go almost entirely digital overnight. I mentioned that we had a strategic plan for the next 3 years, and the first year, 2020, of course, has been hit by COVID. So we did transition and adjust. So on the screen, you'll see 6 examples, which I will quickly go through. The first image at the top left is an ASEAN effort. The ASEAN Committee on Culture and Information, in commemoration of the ASEAN Month and the 2020 Year of ASEAN Identity, produced a Break the Chain, the Arts Respond to COVID-19 an Awareness campaign. The video project aims to promote health and safety protocols like hand washing, wearing of face masks, and physical distancing through a compilation of video performances of traditional, folk, and classical dances from the ASEAN member states broadcast on social media. The next image shows a diaspora collaboration by the Filipino community in Toronto, Canada, where they staged a 2-day, 18-hour streaming event from their website, which was a compilation of traditional and contemporary cultural performances interspersed by interviews of embassy and Canadian government officials and prominent Filipinos in Canada. So instead of the usual Philippine parade and festivities to celebrate our Independence Day, they took everything online. The last 4 images are examples of what my office has been doing and sharing through all our foreign service posts around the world. Our Cultural Diplomacy Division, led by my colleague Chris Popov and her team, quickly adjusted our cultural diplomacy strategic plan and have collaborated with different cultural agencies and individuals to produce shows streamed over Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram to a global audience of thousands. You can see our video of the ballet production of Mir Inisa, a love story of a Muslim princess in Mindanao in celebration of Eid al-Fitr. The next image was a collaboration with a young multi-awarded chef, Luis Mabulo, for 5-minute segments that mixes Philippine history, tourism, and cuisine. The next image is the recent collaboration with the Cultural Center of the Philippines on the staging of a Filipino zarzuela, or a musical theater production, to celebrate our national history and national language month. And finally, the last image is a screen grab of our work with the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the National Quincentennial Commission, which is a series of webinars on Philippine history and activities in preparation of the celebration of the quincentennial next year of the circumnavigation of the globe by Ferdinand Magellan and Sebastian Elcano, which is, by the way, an excellent example of Asia-Europe cultural relations. The benefits of going digital, as you can see, are being able to reach out to a global audience in numbers you would not normally get for a live performance, and at a fraction of the cost. And as Ambassador Faber mentioned, the challenges are really both technological and experiential. Technological, because as a government agency in a developing country, we may not have the latest equipment nor the best internet connections to give better visual quality programs. And experientially, because as was mentioned, cultural performances are always best viewed from the perspective of both the performer and the audience live. So, but under the circumstances, what we have now digitally is better than isolation.
Thank you for that. And I see a question from Dr. Ivana Haliskova-Baltra from France, who brings up the idea of cultural and health diplomacy. And I think these overlaps were very well addressed by the example just shared by Ambassador Menez. She says, I see many, many overlaps between cultural and health diplomacy. which can enrich values mutually. What do you think? And I think we definitely agree, and your example was a beautiful illustration. Thank you. And I'll now turn to Marie for her thoughts. Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anupama. So I guess I will share some example of experience which are digital, or what I would call more also like hybrid, using both digital format and more like local-based type of format, but with a European or Asian or international dimension. So could I have the first slides, please? So basically, I just wanted to share first, voila, thank you very much. The first two initiatives by National Cultural Institute, so Pro Helvetia for Swiss artists and Swiss cultural professionals, but for projects which could be run digitally, also with eventually an international dimension. And another call, I could have taken many calls, but I took also this one from the Japan Foundation office in Bangkok, which had a special call specifically for the arts and community professional in Thailand, but in relation with project with an Asian dimension as well. What I find interesting with these two examples is that how some National Cultural Institute Foundation funding body could readapt their scheme, and I know also that the Asia Europe Foundation is one of them, also to answer to a particular context. How with this artists and cultural professionals are paid, because once again, many things are going online or are into hybrid format, but people are not paid. So they could at least have a basic or some funding for this. And I think it will also, in relation with our topic, for sure, that kind of experimentation also for funders, policymakers, will also help to revisit scheme in the future in relation on how to support cultural cooperation, exchange, like beyond the pandemic, because for sure it may last, or there will be also like further consequences. The other example I wanted to take, and here also with some multilateral type of dimension, so can I have the second slide, please? Is one example with, voilà, thank you, with IETM. IETM is the International Network for Contemporary Performing Arts. They have more than 450 members in Europe, of course, but also internationally as well as in Asia. And usually they have this, biannual meeting in different cities. And for this year, of course, they couldn't. And what is interesting here is that not everything has turned online. That means that at the level of country, there will be like 20 meetings, including as well in Asia Pacific, in Yokohama, Hong Kong, Melbourne, and Sydney. So people will gather at a more like national level, having some conversation on also like international collaboration in the performing arts. And they will have also a joint meeting with the whole group online. So I think also in an ASEF kind of dimension, it's quite an interesting example. And in relation with our subject, I would like also to add that IETM is the new member of this EU-funded platform, the Cultural Relation Platform, which was called before the Cultural Diplomacy Platform, which is led by the Goethe Institute and which also invests into culture, into international relation of the European Union. So it's quite interesting to see an independent network of this. And another example, very quickly, I wanted to give also the Festival Academy, which is a training program for festival manager, very international, but also, of course, with festival manager emerging more experience also from Europe and Asia. So for the past month, there have been also like peer-to-peer type of meeting with different time zones, depending on where you are located in the world, and also with some sessions which are directly for the alumni, but also for some public sessions. So, and it goes to my last point, this access to resource, this access also to information, it's like very much more important in this context. And I will go to the third slide, where I would like just to share two examples among the many we could have explained. So the first one is the National Gallery of Singapore with their Perspective magazine. And I think it's interesting as well, because we see more articles as well, sharing stories about also more marginalized community. Here it's an article about artistic practices and also the transgender community in Indonesia, for instance. And you have also series of talk like organized by Dutch Culture, which is the National Institute for the Netherlands, on what they call infected cities. So cities also affected by the pandemics, also with focus on Shanghai, Jakarta, to name some Asian city, also bringing together creators, architects. So having this conversation, getting access to context. But two challenges I would still see is definitely this question of who access the funding, because the funding is more limited, even if adapted. And also this overload of information. We don't know, we are all facing that. We don't know where to look at when we have access to technology. And at the same time, there are also gaps of knowledge which are not fully addressed with this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers, for that exhaustive list of examples and raising issues. I'm going to quickly bring in a question that we have from several members of the audience who have sort of worded the same thing in different ways. And this question comes to us from Ambassador Celia Ferreira at the Embassy of the Philippines in Lisbon, Diane Lepana, the Vice Consul of the Philippine Embassy in Beijing, and from the Orature Collective in faraway Kenya. How can we really claim to connect people and build trust through cultural activities when we are in fact relying entirely on virtual means, and where the face-to-face element is conspicuous by its absence? So is it possible to build trust virtually? Any of you want to have a go at this question?
Could I start, perhaps?
Yes, Ambassador Menyas, please.
With respect to this question, I think it's like a relationship. I mean, you don't fall in love overnight, unless you believe in love at first sight. But it's the beginning of a conversation. So through cultural diplomacy, we aim to start the conversation with the people who may have not known much about the country. And if their interest is piqued, then the relationship continues. So we hope that by putting ourselves out there, more people who would otherwise have not learned anything or not have heard of the Philippines, for example, will be able to have the seed of interest. And this is supported also by what our tourism department is doing. They have a project now. It's called Wake Up in the Philippines. So even though people cannot travel, they're already working on hoping that people will see this, and when they are able to travel, consider the Philippines as one of their first destinations. So it's the same with culture. We plant the seed, hoping that it will grow.
Thank you, Marie. Ambassador Faber, any thoughts at this moment? No, if not, we'll continue. So,
I have just Marie. A very short one.
Please,
I
Ambassador.
find more of it like an observation. I find it is interesting that the same questions comes from different parts of the world, and that is the first step of understanding, and that's the relevance of meetings like this, so that we do that.
Thank you for that, Marie. Any thoughts?
I guess the internet or online kind of meeting, we all know that cannot replace everything, but they can be here as a way to compensate what we cannot reach now with physical mobility, for instance. So I guess also we can see, and I try to show that also through some of the example, we can see also new space of trust being built as well. I mean, many people say as well, before I didn't have the occasion, let's say, to discuss with this curator, to meet with this producer. And because there was like some form of facilitated connection. In some case, I don't say it's always like that, but for instance, networks meeting or performing arts fairs sometimes are more open than when you have to go there. So I guess we need to find advantage of and a kind of balance in that kind of use of physical and digital type of encounter.
Yeah, that's a great thought. The gatekeepers have somehow been bypassed by going digital in some cases, while in other cases, I suppose, where digital access is difficult, the access itself becomes a gatekeeper in this sort of new reality. But interesting to hear and see how not only independent arts organizations, but also national public agencies responsible for culture are adapting both their existing programs and grant schemes, as well as their formats to embrace the new realities. And I hope we're going to have more of this as we go forward in the coming years. I'm going to now turn to you to ask, what trends do you anticipate for the next 3 to 5 years? Because I think we're all beginning to understand that we are going to live with the new normal for a few years. And what strategies would you really advocate both to diplomats as well as to artists and cultural professionals in order to keep cultural cooperation between Asia and Europe going despite the odds that we are facing? Marie, could I perhaps turn to you first?
Thank you, Anupama. I twisted a little bit your question, if I may, more than talking about trends, because I think some of the trends we are talking about, like digital format, or I know some of the questions are coming in also on this question of climate change, environmental sustainability. I mean, these trends were already there, I would say, but now there is a kind of acceleration phase. So now it's how also, instead of trends, maybe we could also think of build an ideal type of scenario for fairer and more sensitive type of international cultural cooperation, as you name it. That could be based on more on process than more than on event and showcase. That could promote as well longer and more sustainable form of exchange, connected more to local audience and to local communities in all their diversity. And that could be related to more adapted, flexible and co-conceived funding support. So again, I think what is being experienced now, or what you are also experiencing at the level of ASEF, for instance, is very interesting. And also related to that, this question of consistency, this question of trust, as many people mention as well, and the legacy, what do we create for the future as well? And in terms of idea, in terms of proposal, I would also relate to a quote from the French economist Éloi Laurent, who said, "We collaborate to do, we cooperate to learn." And I really like this kind of learning process. So I would say 3 forms of proposal very quickly: more training and consistent training, information session for diplomats. I know in some cases it's happening, but not in all countries. For diplomats who are not specifically focusing on arts and culture, but at least to have some session to sensitize them on this question on arts and culture, and also the working condition of artists and cultural professionals. And I think it could help as well, in many cases, to facilitate some visa process, because we forget about this big issue, which also happen in the Asia, Europe, and of course internationally, because there is less physical mobility right now, but this question of visa is also very important. So the more diplomats would be, or people working in consulates, will be sensitized on the issue, the best it will be. I would say as well more training, capacity building for the sector, and particularly for independent artists and cultural professionals to internationalize their career. So this is very important, and how we can work also at a multilateral level on this. I mean, if people are interested, I could introduce some example that we are doing in France or in Cambodia a few years ago. And it's important, we were talking about that also like through the Q&A, to have this training session as more as possible inclusive, also with regard to more marginalized communities, for instance, and training which would be also contextualized. We are all experts, so we can also work much more on this peer-to-peer learning in that kind of training session. And last but not least, very quickly, support, this you understood, I guess, support access to online resource, which at national and international level in different type of language, because not everybody have access to the internet and not everybody speaks English. So this is also something that we learn even more throughout this period. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. Could I turn to you now, Ambassador Mendes, for your thoughts?
Yes, with respect to trends, I think the underlying condition regarding this question depends really on what the future holds in terms of the effects of the pandemic. Will there be a vaccine that will allow return to normalcy as early as next year? But I believe that the cultural sector wants a return to live performances because their livelihoods depend on repetitive activities, and the restrictions, as was mentioned by Marie, and they need the restrictions on the free reproduction and distribution of their intellectual output. But in any event, I think some things have evolved and may not completely return to business as usual. The first is the collaborations I described earlier will not disappear. There will be more platforms online to present and promote culture, I believe. The increased cultural collaborations as a result of the pandemic will heighten the sense of virtual unity among cultural workers and institutions, with its effects reaching globally. These groups will be encouraged to work together, continue working together, and even private actors will take it upon themselves to collaborate among each other and across oceans. With this trend, the creative industry is going to see a boost as innovative ways to connect and approximate human interaction will be one of those new norms. Also, further, to take advantage of the global market, traditional arts will have to adapt to technology-based delivery of presentations and products. Hence, the convergence of the traditional and heritage arts and the contemporary creative arts is also probably another trend. On Asia-Europe cultural cooperation, the near-term activity insofar as the Philippines and other Asian countries along the circumnavigation route of Magellan and Elcano will be the 2021 quincentennial. But the work of regional, interregional global organizations such as ASEF and UNESCO continue to play a very important role. And now that I've met Marie, the enlightened views of organizations representing the cultural sector for a more global outreach is also something that, as I mentioned, is already starting and will be further expanded. So I am already volunteering that the stakeholder conference we had here in the Philippines among the Philippine stakeholders, we want to expand to international stakeholders of cultural diplomacy as well. So we will continue the conversation offline, Marie, so that the opportunities that you offered and are looking for will also be shared with all the Philippine artists here in our country.
Thank you, Ambassador Mendes. Very glad to see that collaborations are being forged through this conversation for future action. Ambassador Faba, may I turn to you for your ideas on future trends and some strategies to cope with the new realities?
Thank you. I think, first of all, I would like to agree with Marie on the fact that many of the trends have already been there before, so we have to build on them. And some of them have been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. The second point I wanted to make is a little bit to say, well, we will probably have a vaccine over the next few months or whatever. But I think on the other side, the next virus is just around the corner. So we need also to look at in that context, and I think it's also important for the art world and for the cultural world to look at the origins. Where does this come from? And we in that sense, maybe we have also to look at the issues of how does humanity explore wildlife, wild nature, and I think these are very important facts that we need to look at, and they cannot be ignored. Now, of course, then comes the question of equity and access to both funds, but also to technology. And I think this is also something there, again, where especially also on the multilateral side, we have to work on that to guarantee that those who are maybe better off also assist those who are less well off. I think these are also things that we need to address, and especially, again, also if we're talking about the digital world, about the digital divide, I think that is something that is extremely important, and that includes, of course, and I think Marie also was talking about that on the education, training, access to knowledge and information. I think this is all very, very important. And I'd like to also commend Ambassador Menez for the mention of the circumnavigation of the Earth, which was not the first thing of globalization, but it was certainly an important step. And so all of this is part of our human history and human culture. And we should, in that sense, I think, also work towards an awareness of a global culture in that sense. And of course, we have different views and values sometimes, but we also have common humanity, human values. So not to speak of human rights, but overall I think we should also concentrate on that part. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughts. And I'm quickly looking at the questions that are coming in from our audiences, and some of them you have already actually responded to in your comments, but I'm going to just highlight a few interesting things that are coming up. The question of underrepresentation, whether of certain groups of artists, audiences, or even certain countries in the world of cultural diplomacy is a question that's coming up. Are developing countries disadvantaged in presenting themselves on the world stage? Is cultural diplomacy really a level playing field? What are we, and this question comes from Dr. Munir Musa in Pakistan, and we have a question from Vietnam, from Trang Vu, who asks, how can we make sure that at-risk groups are better represented within the cultural work that we do? And we also have, again, interestingly, many people asking quite similar questions, and we have a question about multilateralism from Sanjukta Ghosh at the SOAS South Asia Institute, and also from Assistant Professor Koljanova from Russia. How will multilateral agencies shape the future of cultural diplomacy? We have, in fact, touched on a few of these issues, but if any of you have any comments, thoughts, ideas, anything that you'd like to add in terms of this question of equity and access, the floor is yours. If not, I'll move to take on a few more questions. Any comments at this stage?
Yeah, just briefly, because I've mentioned that already before, but I think indeed that the multilateral agencies have a great responsibility to do that, especially as we see that many more vulnerable groups or underrepresented groups do not have access to the resources that we're talking about. So I think it is up to the responsibility of, especially of the multilaterals to sensitize also the bilaterals to look at these issues. So I think it is, and it's not because a country or a region or a certain population group does not have access, or that it doesn't have culture, and that it doesn't have the possibility or to share its heritage and its culture. So I think these are global responsibilities that also we need to look at globally. Thanks.
Thank you. Ambassador Faber, you spoke about humans' relationship with nature, and we have a question relating to the role of cultural diplomacy in addressing the climate crisis. And this question comes to us from Rui Montero at the University of Porto. Any thoughts on the interlinkages between culture and the environmental movements around us? Any of the speakers?
I don't want to monopolize, but briefly again, because especially on the virus, I mean, if we look at the origin of well, it is we are told that the virus comes from a wet market in China, but it didn't origin there. It didn't find its origin there. It probably had its origin somewhere in the jungle, maybe on bats, and the bats were, and I think it's the fact that we go deeper and deeper into the jungle and explore more and more, exploit more and more the natural resources without a sustainable way. I think that is something that we really need to look at, because natural resources are unfortunately limited.
Thank you, Ambassador. Marie, I'll turn to you now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big question, which could be like the topic of a full webinar. But indeed, I mean, again, this is not a new trend. I mean, many artists and cultural professional organizations have been working on this particular issue through their practices, and also many organizations, including funding organization, institution, are thinking as well on how to green process, or also on making more sustainable type of collaboration. This is also part of the trends that I twisted a bit in my answer, how to go towards more like sustainable and longer type of collaboration. I know there are a lot of discussion right now at the level of festival, for instance. How can we sometimes like avoid the one-shot type of invitation and invite maybe less groups, but for longer period, being more connected to local community. So it's sustainability taken really in a very holistic manner. And I will just share in the chat also an initiative which is both Asia, Europe, and at the same time connected to Latin America, which is called GALA, Green Art Lab Alliance, which was also like activated by Yasmin Ostendorf, with whom you work at the Asia Europe Foundation. So you can find also a very interesting initiative at the level of the sector, but also like with other type of institution and organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And to just add on to what you have said about the GALA network, which is really working at the intersection of culture and environmental sustainability. Some of you who are really interested in the topic may find our green guides that we put out at the Asia Europe Foundation through our Culture 360 website of interest. We're looking at each country, how they see environmental sustainability in the Asia Europe context, and how our cultural practitioners engaging with this topic in a very, very holistic way. So if you're interested, just visit culture360.asef.org and look for the green guides. I'm going to turn back once again to questions from our audience. How best to measure the success of a cultural diplomacy project? I think this is a tough one. This comes from Sunita Vijayasinghan at the Singapore International Foundation. I'm just quickly going to look at a few others as well and then turn to you for some answers. What is the contribution of cultural diplomacy to the future international preparedness for future pandemics? And this question comes to us from Andrew Armstrong, who's the director of the Drew Wiley Consultancy in Scotland. And we have a question from the Taoist Mission in Singapore. What role for cultural diplomacy in promoting intercultural and interreligious dialogue among nations? So, any thoughts?
If I may, Anupama.
Please.
And I'd like to address some of the earlier questions.
Yes.
In particular, the question about developing countries being at a disadvantage. I would actually say that we were at a disadvantage before the shift to digital cultural diplomacy is concerned, because in terms of resources, financial resources, developing countries may not have the equivalent amounts to spend on sending ballet troops or staging large events in other countries several times a year. But now that is digital, the technology is much more accessible. And as I said, creativity is not the monopoly of a developing nation. And so it really depends on how the cultural sector and the government work together in order to best portray or to send or conduct cultural diplomacy. The other question about underrepresented sectors of society. Again, this is something that needs to be the subject of a conversation between the government and the other stakeholders, where those who might not have the national stature or national access to funding should also be given a chance to present their own indigenous culture, and this is something that we're keenly aware of. And I think perhaps, again, relating it to developing countries, the indigenous peoples of many developing countries should take advantage of cultural diplomacy in order to portray what their beliefs and culture is all about. And related to that, of course, is addressing climate change, because many of the indigenous people's ways of life are sustainable. And with the SDGs, being worked on, cultural diplomacy has a very important role to play as far as addressing global issues like climate change are concerned.
Thank you, Ambassador Marie. Ambassador Faber, any thoughts on any of the questions that have been raised by our audience?
If I may.
Marie, yes, please. Please.
Just very quickly, because I see that we are also running out of time, so I will be very quick. I will really also go into what Ambassador Menes say about, this question about like as a non so wealthy country, like maybe we are less visible on this question of cultural diplomacy. And that's why I think this notion, after some people may say it's only a question of words to talk about cultural relation, which take into consideration multiple type of actor, multiple type of sector, be it the non-profit, being the private sector, being the institution. And I think it's interesting as well to look at this concept of fair, or at least fairer international cultural collaboration. And I put in the chat before a publication which was done in partnership with Dutch Culture, IETM, and On the Move, and written by Mike van Graan, on a kind of toolkit on how to work on fairer international collaboration based on the fact that we are in a very unfair world, and how in the process of collaboration, what could you bring as resource, which do not have to be always financial, but which can be in relation to your knowledge on environmental challenge, for instance. So this is also interesting to look at, and how we can put that more and more in a consistent way into practice. Two other points I wanted to highlight on this question on evaluation of cultural diplomacy or action at an international level. I will share in the chat, sorry, it's professional deformation. On the Move is about sharing resources, so I share a lot of resources. A quite interesting report and a toolkit which was made by Goethe Institute a few years ago about this question of evaluation of international collaboration and cooperation. Is called Culture Works, and also with some methodology which can be useful into evaluating impact of what you create, particularly in a short but also longer term perspective. So I will share that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Any thoughts, Ambassador Faber, before we start winding down our conversation?
I think that the two panelists have said all that there was to be said, at least from my side. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think our last time is really upon us, and we need to start winding down. I think what we've heard today is really a reaffirmation of some of the trends that we did see in cultural diplomacy even before the pandemic, the slow move from self-promotion towards values promotion. And as Ambassador Faber very beautifully put it, it's not only about national values, but there are several things that are our common human values. And we do see slowly the shift from self-promotion to values promotion, from merely show and tell and nation building towards what we can call mutually beneficial collaboration and cooperation, where both sides co-create the cultural diplomacy project, and where, as Ambassador Faber has pointed out, artistic freedom is respected, thus in a way bringing together government on one hand and artists, because this is a common concern of artists while getting involved in state-led projects, also with respect to giving a living wage for our artists. And I think this is a debate that is now raging at a time when a lot of things are being provided culturally, but for free. We enjoy it, but will we pay for it? Perhaps not. So I think this is an issue that Marie has also very strongly put on the table. And we are, I hope, in cultural diplomacy in the years to come, moving towards what Marie looks at as fair international cultural cooperation, what I would like to call a cultural fair trade of sorts. And from the few things that we are seeing digitally and what has been shared today, things do look optimistic. And it was very inspiring to hear, for instance, the example that Ambassador Menyes shared from the Philippines of conversations between government and civil society stakeholders. And I think such multi-stakeholder dialogues on culture are the way to build a newer future for the cultural system, which is really facing an onslaught right now. As we all know, public gatherings are not taking place around the world. Cultural venues are shut temporarily, and slowly some of these temporary closures are indeed becoming permanent. And artists, especially those working on a freelance basis, are really facing a crisis in terms of a sustainable livelihood for the future. We also did look at a couple of areas that I think require definitely more conversations, more ideas, funding, a sustainable funding model for our artists. And I see in our audiences commenting that particularly in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, I see a lot of artists who are commenting that building new ecosystems is critical, particularly after the COVID crisis. More training, not only for our artists, but also for our diplomats to understand the cultural sector better was a recommendation that was raised. And I hope that a future conversation at the international level between government officials in charge of culture and, on the other hand, the cultural community could be something that ASEF also collaborates with On the Move and Ambassador Menyes and the Philippines on. It will be absolutely fantastic to take this idea forward. So these are some of the ideas we have heard today. We could talk, I think, for hours, and we set ourselves up for a very ambitious conversation, looking at everything from the philosophical to the practical. So I hope for our audiences, there has been some food for thought. And before we wrap up, I just want to give the last word back to our speakers and ask them, you have been working in the area of cultural diplomacy and cultural relations now for many, many years. Between the three of you, I think there's about 100 years of cultural experience. So I'm going to ask you as the last word, what advice would you give your younger selves if you had to do any one of your cultural diplomacy projects again? What would you do differently? Who wants to go first?
Oh, okay, well, let me
Please, Ambassador Menyes.
Advice to my younger self, probably first buy Zoom stock. But seriously, no, I will refer to the recommendations. Getting a good foundation on the principles and objectives of public and cultural diplomacy is important for diplomats, because learning on the job takes a long time, and you're not. I guess you might suffer the wrong examples depending on who you talk to and the experience of a particular ministry or government in that particular field. But learning about public diplomacy and culture in an international setting in particular would be an excellent start for a quicker appreciation and implementation of that particular field. And I think ASEF is doing a very good job with your public diplomacy courses.
Thank you, Ambassador Menyes. Marie, Ambassador Faber.
If I may briefly, in all modesty, I think my biggest contribution to cultural diplomacy was when I could play together with my friend Pablo, the Cuban ambassador, at a jazz festival in Vientiane. It was actually my first ever concert that I gave. So I think, and to answer your question would be, I should have invested more in that before. especially learning to play the guitar. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Marie.
Thank you. I guess one important point, and I see it also with my professional path. It's important to, I mean, let's say for people who are becoming or are diplomat or are studying it, I don't know, also like among the audience, to have a training or to have an experience in another sector. And since we are here about cultural diplomacy, so in the arts and cultural sector, it really helps to understand better the working condition of artists and cultural professionals. And after in your own institution, beyond the, we know the question of bureaucracy, policy orientation, and so on, but to be more sensitized to the issue and to be an advocate about the issue. And I see one of the questions which, of Liz Galvez, who say like culture is not a priority for financial support. So how can we all be advocates? There are many advocacy platforms in Europe, in Asia as well, but we need to find allies as well, both in institution, in the diplomatic type of organization. So to have both this experience really helps to understand as well the challenge we face in the independent arts and cultural sector, and also the challenge we can face and how to go through it in more diplomatic or institution. And just a word, we need more women diplomats. So I think this is important. The women are still very much underrepresented, not only in the arts and cultural sector in the important function, I would say, but in general. And I guess this is also not only an Asia-Europe issue, it's international. So go for it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And on that note, we'll have to end this conversation. Thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience of over 300 people who are joining us live today. Thank you very much for taking the time to be part of this conversation. And please do tune in to our next webinar, which will be on access to education and human rights education on the 23rd of September. And registration is now open. Stay safe, everyone. And for now, it's goodbye from the Asia Europe Foundation. Ciao, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.